Welcome to our deep dive, you guys, into 1 Peter 4, 1 through 19.
Okay.
This passage is like a pep talk, I think, for people going through hard times.
Yeah.
You know, those moments where living out your faith feels like walking uphill in the wind, right?
Yeah, definitely.
But we've got the source material right here, ready to unlock some wisdom.
Absolutely. And, it's interesting. This letter was written to early Christians facing some pretty intense persecution. So it's
Yeah.
like a firsthand account of resilience and faith under fire.
It really is, and it makes you think about how these words written so long ago can still speak to us now.
Mm-hmm.
Like so much of what they went through back then, it resonates with what we're dealing with today.
For sure. Yeah.
I'm curious, before we jump in, what in these first few verses really stood out to you?
Honestly, what gets me is how Peter connects suffering with transformation. Like in verse 1, he says, "For as much then as Christ has suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves likewise with the same mind, for he that hath suffered in the flesh hath ceased from sin." It's kind of like saying, look, even Jesus went through it.
Right.
And it was through his suffering that he found ultimate freedom. We can tap into that same power,
You know, that's a really interesting point because we often try to avoid suffering at all costs.
Oh, yeah.
But Peter's suggesting that there's something transformative about it.
Yeah.
Something that can bring us closer to God.
Exactly. And he's not saying go hurt yourself or anything like that. It's more about a change in mindset.
Yeah.
Choosing to align ourselves with God's will even when it's tough.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
It's like, okay, this is happening, but how can I grow from this experience?
Right. So he talks about the will of the Gentiles in verse 3.
Yeah.
What were some of the behaviors that they were doing that seemed to go against this new life that he was talking about?
Well, he mentions some specific things like lasciviousness, lusts, excess of wine revelings, banquetings, and abominable idolatries. So
Okay.
basically, a lot of indulging in things that pull us away from God.
Yeah. Those are some strong words. And, it's interesting because those temptations, they aren't ancient history.
No, not at all.
We might not be building altars to Zeus these days.
Right.
But we've got our own versions of excess and distractions.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's what makes this passage so relevant,
Mhm.
It's not about judging or condemning people, but it's more like a friend saying, hey, I get it, those things look appealing.
Right.
But they won't bring you lasting joy, remember?
It's almost like he's saying, we've all been down those roads before and they lead to dead ends.
Yeah,
How about we try something different?
totally.
So what does he offer as this alternative path?
Well, he calls us to live not for those fleeting pleasures, but for something deeper, something with more meaning,
Yeah.
He says to live according to God's will.
Okay.
Verses 2 and 3 really emphasize that shift in thinking.
Okay, so let's talk about this idea of God's will for a second.
Okay.
Because I think this is where people get tripped up.
Sure.
Is it like this big checklist, in the sky?
Right.
This set of rules that we got to follow perfectly?
Uh-huh.
Or is it something a little bit more complex than that?
That's a great question.
Hmm.
I think it's less about specific rules and more about a way of being,
Okay.
It's about developing a heart that's in line with God's heart,
Yeah.
a heart full of love and service and wanting to reflect his character in everything we do.
Yeah.
It's almost like becoming more godlike in how we think and act and interact with the world around us.
I love that.
Yeah.
So it's not so much about what we're doing, but why we're doing it.
Right.
The motivation behind our actions.
Exactly. And then in verse 7, Peter adds, "The end of all things is at hand."
Oh, yeah.
Now, it's easy to read that and think, oh no, the world's ending.
Right.
But I don't think that's what he's trying to say.
Okay, so if it's not about panicking about the end of the world, then what do you think he means by that?
Well, he's writing to a community that was facing some very real threats.
Right.
Their world could literally end at any moment.
Mm.
So I think it's less about a specific timeline and more about a sense of urgency.
Oh.
It's about realizing that our time is precious and making the most of every moment.
So aligning our actions with our values and making sure that every decision we make, every step we take is a reflection of what we really believe.
Exactly.
It's like saying don't waste your life on things that don't matter.
Precisely. And then to emphasize that point, he goes on to talk about love.
Yes, verses 8 and 9 are so powerful.
Yeah.
It says, have fervent charity among yourselves, for charity shall cover the multitude of sins, and use hospitality one to another without grudging.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if this passage had a theme song, it would be love.
It really would. It's front and center, and it's not just this warm, fuzzy feeling.
Right.
It's about action,
Yeah.
doing good, and being generous even when it's hard.
Why do you think love is given so much attention in this passage?
Yeah.
It's right in the middle of all this talk about suffering and persecution, so it's got to be important, right?
Absolutely. I mean, if we look at the big picture, love is at the very core of the Christian faith,
Hmm.
right? It's how we know God, and it's what sets us apart as his followers. And practically speaking, love has this incredible power to heal and restore and bring people together, especially when things are tough.
Right, so if suffering can lead to transformation,
Yeah,
love is what keeps us going through those hard times.
for sure.
It's like the antidote to all that stuff he was warning about earlier, like excess and selfishness.
Yeah.
It's a whole different way of interacting with the world.
It is, you make a great point. Love creates a different kind of atmosphere, one where grace and forgiveness can thrive.
And speaking of grace, verse 10 talks about being good stewards of the manifold grace of God. I love that phrase. I sometimes struggle with what it actually means in everyday life. How do you understand that?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that everything we have, our talents, our resources, even our lives, are gifts from God.
Yeah.
We didn't earn them, and we certainly don't deserve them. So
Right.
we're called to be good stewards of those gifts,
Okay.
using them wisely and generously, not just for ourselves, but to help others and build up our community.
So it's almost like we're managing something precious that's not actually ours.
Exactly. And it's not just about material things either.
Okay.
It's about our time,
Yeah.
our energy, our compassion, our words.
Right.
All of those are things we've been given to use responsibly.
That's a good point. So it's not just about receiving grace, but about letting it flow through us out into the world.
Exactly.
It's a continuous cycle of giving and receiving.
Precisely. And that idea of stewardship connects perfectly with the next section where Peter starts talking about facing trials with joy.
That's right, verses 12 through 16.
Yep.
Now, this is where we get into the nitty-gritty of what it actually means to live out our faith when things get tough.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not always easy, is it?
It definitely isn't, and he doesn't sugarcoat it either.
Right.
He even uses the phrase fiery trial,
Oh, yeah.
which paints a pretty intense picture, don't you think?
It really does. Like, you can almost feel the heat.
Yeah.
But even in the middle of all that hardship,
Yeah.
he tells them to rejoice.
Uh-huh.
That always throws me off. How can you rejoice in suffering?
Yeah.
Isn't that a contradiction?
It might seem that way at first.
Right.
But remember, these early Christians were dealing with some serious persecution. This wasn't some theory for them. It was
Yeah.
their everyday life.
Yeah.
So when Peter talks about rejoicing, I don't think he's saying enjoy the pain or pretend everything's fine.
Right.
It's about finding hope and meaning, even when times are tough.
So it's more about perspective,
Yeah.
choosing to focus on the bigger picture,
Exactly.
even when you're surrounded by darkness.
It's about remembering that we're not alone in our suffering.
Yeah.
We're united with Christ in his suffering.
Right.
And ultimately, his victory is our victory, too.
That's powerful, finding strength in that connection,
Yeah.
knowing that even when things are falling apart around us, we're still held and loved.
Yes, and Peter makes a really important distinction in verse 15
Okay.
between suffering for doing wrong and suffering as a Christian.
Oh, that's interesting. He says, but let none of you suffer as a murderer or as a thief or as an evildoer or as a busybody in other men's matters. So it's not like all suffering is good.
Right.
It's specifically talking about suffering because you're faithful to God.
Exactly.
Almost like a badge of honor in a way.
I wouldn't say a badge of honor necessarily. It's
Right.
more about integrity.
Okay.
It's about making sure our actions match up with our beliefs.
Uh-huh.
And that if we do suffer, it's not because of our own bad choices,
Right.
but because of our commitment to following Christ.
So it's about standing before God with a clear conscience,
Yeah,
knowing that you did your best to live a life that reflects his love and his truth.
absolutely. And then in verses 17 through 19, the tone kind of shifts. We start to see this theme of judgment coming up,
Right.
which I think makes sense following all this talk about suffering.
Yeah, verse 17 is pretty intense.
Mm-hmm.
He says, for the time has come that judgment must begin at the house of God. And if it first begin at us, what shall the end be of them that obey not the gospel of God? That part makes me a little nervous.
Yeah, I can see why. It reminds us that even as believers, we're not exempt.
Right.
God holds us to a higher standard.
Yeah.
And there will be a day of reckoning.
So it's not about God being mean or anything, but about him holding his people accountable for how they live their lives.
Exactly.
Like a parent who disciplines their child because they love them and want what's best for them.
That's a perfect analogy. It's like a refining process,
Yeah.
purifying us and making us more like him.
Right. Chipping away at the rough edges.
Exactly. And then he says, And if the righteous scarcely be saved, where shall the ungodly and the sinner appear?
Wow, that's powerful.
Mm.
It really makes you think.
It does. It highlights the seriousness of judgment
Right,
and the importance of aligning our lives with God's will. This isn't some abstract idea.
right.
It has real consequences.
So it's not just about avoiding punishment in the afterlife.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that the choices we make now have eternal implications.
Exactly.
The life we build here is a reflection of the eternity we're choosing.
That's it. And I think that's why the last verse of this section is so beautiful. It says, "Wherefore let them that suffer according to the will of God commit the keeping of their souls to him in well-doing as unto a faithful Creator."
Yeah.
It's a picture of complete surrender and trust even when we don't know what's going to happen.
It's about letting go of our control
Yeah.
and putting our lives in God's hands.
Yes.
Knowing that he's got us no matter what.
It's like saying, okay, God, I don't understand everything,
Right.
but I trust you.
Yeah.
I trust your goodness and your plan, and I'm giving my life to you.
That's a beautiful message to hold on to.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when life throws those curveballs, you know,
Absolutely.
and you feel lost and confused.
Yeah,
It reminds us that we're not alone in this journey,
that's right.
no matter what we face.
No matter what. So as we wrap up our deep dive into 1 Peter 4, 1 through 19,
Yeah.
what are some key takeaways you think our listeners should remember?
Yeah.
Like if they could walk away with just a few nuggets of wisdom, what would they be?
Well, for me, what really stuck out is that suffering isn't something we should be afraid of.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Right.
it's actually a chance for us to grow and change.
Yeah.
Choosing to follow God's plan, even when it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing that on the other side of that struggle, we become closer to him.
I totally agree. That's so important. And building on that, I think we need to remember that we're called to live with purpose, you know?
Yeah.
Not for those temporary pleasures, but for something much bigger than ourselves.
Yeah.
We're called to put love first,
Mm-hmm.
to serve others with a genuine heart,
Yeah.
and use our unique gifts to make a real difference in the world.
Yes, we're not just here to take and hoard stuff, you know?
Right.
We're here to give back, to pour back into the world the same love and grace that we've received.
Absolutely. And remembering that everything we have, every breath we take is a gift.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we can't forget about the power of joy, even when things are tough.
Right.
We talked about this earlier,
Yeah.
but it's so important to remember.
Yeah.
Knowing that we're connected to Christ and his suffering gives us this deep hope and resilience.
Mm,
We know that in the end, his victory is our victory.
that's right.
So we can face those tough times with a sense of peace,
Yeah.
knowing we're not alone.
We're held, we're loved, and we're being guided every step of the way.
I love that.
Yeah.
And lastly, that beautiful image of surrender,
Yeah.
putting our lives in God's hands,
Mm.
trusting that even when we can't see the whole picture,
Right.
he's working everything out for us.
It's like a complete trust fall into the arms of a loving Father
Yes.
who knows us better than we know ourselves. And, you know, as we've been talking about all this, I keep thinking about that verse about judgment starting in the house of God.
Yeah.
It's a powerful image, and it really makes you think, if even the righteous are barely saved, right?
What does that mean for everyone else?
Yeah.
What about those who haven't accepted this way of life,
Right.
a life that follows God's will?
Yeah.
It's something we all need to think about, don't you think?
It really gets to the core of what it means to follow Jesus. You know,
Yeah.
It's not about earning our way to heaven,
Right.
but about recognizing that we desperately need his grace
Mm-hmm.
and giving our lives to him.
Yeah.
It's about making a choice to turn away from selfishness
Right.
and embrace a life of love and service and choosing eternity over those temporary things the world offers.
Wow. That's beautifully put, eternity over fleeting pleasures.
Yeah,
It really makes you stop and think about what truly matters in
Well,
life. You know,
it does.
what are we basing our lives on?
Right.
What will last?
And I think that's the amazing thing about 1 Peter 4, 1 through 19.
Yeah.
It's not just a bunch of rules.
Right.
It's an invitation
Mm-hmm.
to a deeper, more fulfilling way of living.
It's a call to embrace the power of suffering, to find joy in serving others, and to experience the peace that comes from surrendering to our Creator.
Yeah,
It's a journey, and it's not always easy,
for sure.
but it's a journey worth taking.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive.
Okay.
We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking.
Yeah.
And until next time, keep searching, keep asking questions, and keep diving into those truths that light you up.